Okay, so we finally come to one of the most important parts of React, and that is understanding state. State is simply the data that a component maintains. And when I say maintains, I mean it actually can change its value. The reason that's a distinct feature over anything we've learned so far is because props, the other way to pass data from a component to another component, cannot be changed by the component receiving the props. They say in the React documentation that props are immutable or unchangeable. All that means is that I can't receive a prop and then say this dot props dot something equals some new value. Okay, I can't change props. And if I do, it may cause some weirdness with React. So state is different in that it's a way that a component can maintain its own data and change its own data if it needs to. Now let me get rid of this before it becomes confusing because you should not do this. So anytime we're going to introduce state to a component, the first thing is that the component needs to be a class-based component. We'll talk a little bit in the future why, but for now just know that if you want state in a component, or if you want a component to maintain its own data using state, it will need to be a class-based component. The first thing we'll do to introduce state to this component is we need to add a constructor method. Constructor is a specific method that's built into JavaScript that initializes parts of this class. If you're feeling a little unfamiliar with classes, I went and grabbed the link to a Scrimbacast that has some information on classes that you're welcome to pause and go look at really quick. But the important thing to know is that when you have a constructor, it's a place where you're going to be initializing some values. And the first thing you should always do inside of a constructor is make a call to a global function called super. In short, what super does is it goes to the parent class, or what's also called the super class, and it grabs some of the goodies there and brings them down so that our class, or our app component, can use those goodies. One of the main parts of React.component that we'll be using is a method called setState, and that allows us to change state, but we're going to get there. For now, just know that if you have a constructor, you should always add super. And then the only other thing we need to do to add state to this component is to add a property to this called state. And state will always be an object. And so I'm going to set this.state equal to an object. And now I have state in my component. I can access this state anywhere else in my component's code by referencing this.state. Now you'll notice that I have an h1 here that says, is state important to know? So I'm going to add a property to my state as an initial value. The property will be called answer, and its value will be yes. Now take a second to think how you might get that value to show up inside the h1 after this question mark right here. Pause the video and see if you can get that to work. The first thing I'll need to do is add some curly braces because I'm going to be interpreting some JavaScript inside of JSX. And then I simply type this .state .answer. When I refresh the page, you'll see that it shows up on my browser window over to the right. Yes. Here what I'm doing is I'm giving an initial value to my state. This is the data my component will have when it's first initialized. And the special thing about state is that I can always change this to something else later if I want. The only other thing I want to touch on in this lesson before we move on is to mention that we can pass state from this component down to a child component. And remember, the only way we can pass information from one component to another is through props. And so that might look something like this, where I have some kind of child component right here. And of course, if I want to pass any information down to it, it needs to happen through props. So maybe I have a prop that I add called answer, and its value is this .state.answer. Now, the only other thing I want to mention in this lesson for now is that React will do some really cool stuff if we ever change state. And I don't mean changing it here manually in the initial value, but I mean when we use the setState method that I mentioned, which we'll talk about in a couple lessons. But if we ever use that method and change the state, React will automatically update every child component that is receiving parts of that state. And so changing the state will automatically change how things get displayed on the screen. But we'll cover that a little more in depth when we start talking about changing state. For now, take a look at this code and try playing with state a little bit, and we'll move on to a quick practice.